Hey, it's Jess Puddister here, and this is Walking the Walk, a podcast about climate action in Newfoundland and Labrador. For this episode, I was joined by Ashley Smith, Managing Director of Fundamental Inc. She gives us an overview of how her company got involved with municipal climate action planning across the province through the Transitions 2050 project. Ashley's an engineer who is, in a sense, trying to reverse engineer how we approach town infrastructure. She's making the case to let natural landscapes do their thing, in particular, moving water around. And as we all know, climate change in our neck of the woods will be dishing up more water through increasingly intense storms. Leveraging the services of wetlands and unlocking the intelligence of topography allows towns to make smarter decisions about how to develop and how to spend their money. If we're going to make a clear commitment to carbon neutrality, we've got to start translating barriers into opportunity. And this is what eco-asset management is all about. Thanks for coming on board to have a chat today. Maybe we can get started and you can tell us a little bit about what the T2050 project is, how you found out about it, and how the partnership between Fundamental Inc. and NIA came about.
So the Transition 2050 program is an initiative of the Federation for Canadian Municipalities, so FCM. They deliver funding from the Canadian government, and they're the administrative arm. And so this particular program, as the name implies, was set up to support projects which would lead to identification of transition pathways to carbon neutral by 2050 for a group or cohort of municipal partners. And so it was an open call through FCM. And we started reaching out. We had already some pretty solid relationships with municipalities, and we wanted to be sure that we worked with just local entities in order to make something like this happen. And so again, we have a relationship established with NIA, the Newfoundland and Labrador Environmental Industry Association. And we have a working relationship with them. Obviously, we're a member of NIA. And so we started to talk to them and thought, okay, this was a really good way for us to be able to build a team with NIA as the lead proponent, us delivering the service, and a group of 6 municipalities to work together. And our particular project looked at, it was about half sort of like quote unquote consulting that involved training and development of climate action plans, risk and opportunity assessments, and then also a GHG inventory, a carbon inventory for each of the municipalities. So about half of the funding went to that, and the other half went to implementing a capital project. So it's actually capital funding to implement a climate action project that the town identified as the first priority or first project.
That's fantastic. For folks who are listening who are not as plugged into the municipal and climate change response scene as we are, maybe you could just speak a little bit to why should municipalities be prioritizing this kind of work? What's important about this kind of work?
Well, I suppose that depends a little bit on your perspective about municipal priorities. And everybody has to define those for themselves and for their own communities, I imagine. However, in this instance, the 6 communities that we partnered with to deliver the program had already identified that climate action was something that they had committed to and wanted to move forward on, but were, sort of lacking in capacity and funds. Which is the case. It's always time and money, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
the case for a lot of people. Communities are no exception. So that they had, in each of the 6 communities that we worked with, they had identified climate action as something that they wanted to pursue. And this particular project gave them the opportunity to look at that. And so in all instances, and with the climate action plans that we help the communities put together, there's sort of a dual focus on emissions reduction. So which is like in the industry, we call that climate mitigation. It's a very sort of narrow definition of what mitigation means, but climate mitigation means specifically like ways to reduce the carbon emissions created by the town. And so we would look at like sort of the dual criteria of how do we reduce emissions and also save the town money in some aspect. So that could be sort of a lowest life cycle cost thing, and it could be as immediate from a cash flow perspective as, like reducing an energy bill on a building by installing solar panels, or reducing tipping fees associated with your municipal solid waste through like in-community composting on a sizable scale. And so in each of the communities, they chose a project that was best suited for like their particular context and how they felt the money was best spent within their community.
Gotcha. Okay. And what are those 6 communities? We
were very fortunate to get folks from across the island of Newfoundland. So we have Port aux Basques, Stephenville, Baywert, Paradise, Torbay, and Balline.
Right on. And so, yeah, you've got, some rural communities, you've got some sort of suburban communities in and around the metropolitan area of St. John's. I imagine they're facing quite different things, and perhaps quite different impacts of climate change might be expected. Can you tell me a little bit about what it's like working with such drastically different scenarios in this sort of world?
So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those situations where like it's all kind of different and it's all kind of the same. Mm-hmm. The climate change impacts that we're going to face are specific to sort of each section of the island. And so like when we take a resilience lens, which is sort of a fancy way of saying like, how do we try and plan to make sure that you have, a plan A, a plan B, and a plan H sort of situation, right? Like is there a way that like we can choose to address infrastructure and municipal services? Is there a way that we can design those to make them resilient, to make them so that, you would have to take multiple hits in order to have the whole thing collapse? Or there are several ways to sort of fry the same egg so that no matter what happens, the municipality can still function, either in an emergency or, like a year where we have a major event, a major like climate or weather event. And so that's kind of how we just sort of look at things. And then the rest is about listening to what the people with lived experience in each of those places have to tell us. So most of the time, they don't use a climate lexicon. So they don't come to me and say, we know the emissions associated with this tonnage of such and such waste. They don't have that conversation, but we have a conversation that is based on like their history with their community, which is super, Yeah, which is super valuable, because when you really listen, they will tell you the changes that they've seen in their lifetime, and the changes that they know that, like their family has seen in their lifetime. So they'll tell you, like, I've never seen the water that high that many years in a row, or I've never seen that river flood like that, or I've never seen, like, we've never caught that fish in this river before, or I've never seen that bird. And so what they're telling you is that things are changing, and we can take that information and we can shift it so that it actually can be articulated through a climate change lexicon, which satisfies the requirement of, actually creating a climate change action plan, but also you're able to take that and leverage it as the value proposition to lots of different kinds of funding. So, like wastewater and stormwater infrastructure that's normally seen through sort of a very narrow capital works kind of lens can now be viewed through a climate change lens. Because if you are looking at, for example, like an alternative means of addressing your stormwater, you can then say, like, we're going to take an eco-asset management approach to our watershed. And so within that, what you do is you conduct a watershed model, and you identify ways of more closely like mimicking and utilizing the natural hydrological processes that exist within the municipal boundary. So instead of trying to put a pipe in the ground and then wondering whether we've sized that pipe properly, or conversely a culvert, right? It's the same sort of thing, like with a fixed capacity. Like, have we sized that right? Do we know if we've put it in the right place? Do we know we create wetlands, or we utilize the wetlands, or we expand and we engineer the wetlands to actually function like a wetland. So you end up with a situation where it is more resilient, in the sense that, if a pipe fails, everybody knows what happens, right? But a wetland, when it fails, it doesn't fail catastrophically, right? Like you just get, it stays wetter longer, or it expands a little further. But you don't, you don't have roads wash out. You don't have other kinds of situations. So you do that. And then that achieves several things. So the first thing that it achieves is that you end up with a lower life cycle cost of your infrastructure. So you're not trying to put a pipe in the ground that in 15 years will have to be repaired, or might sink, or might shift, or maybe is improperly sized and has to be replaced. So there's a huge emissions avoidance and cost avoidance associated with choosing a more climate sensitive and more resilient solution. So you have that aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is it actually safeguards the way your watershed functions. So most communities that, like, we've dealt with as Fundamental, they have more like wells and septics than they do piped systems. Yes. And so if you're relying on wells to provide potable water for your population, you don't want to create a situation where you're then short-circuiting the delivery of water into the ground, right? Like that is counterproductive. And so you can achieve a lot of things by just asking the question slightly differently. So the question isn't like, what size pipe do I need for, to manage the stormwater? You sort of start at a different point and you say, okay, I'm going to map my watershed, and then I'm going to figure out what the watershed's going to do for me all by itself. And then I'm going to add to what that watershed's capacity is. That's just sort of one example of how taking an eco-asset management approach to a municipality is an effective way of addressing climate change and climate action.
This is amazing. So this to me is in, quite stark contrast to a lot of traditional development approaches, in where we see perhaps builders going into an area and excavating out a wetland and filling it in to create solid ground so that they can put structures exactly where it is they would like to see those structures go, rather than looking at the ground cover and the landscape as having very real value that it can provide to us as a community and like a municipality as an incorporated entity, and that can replace a lot of investment that we would otherwise have to do sort of in an artificial way. That's super fascinating. So is there a situation, within the cohort of municipalities you're working with right now, where this sort of approach is going to become prioritized in the next couple of years?
Yeah. So, I mean, because of the way the funding happens, I mean, everyone has been involved with funding deadlines before, I think, in a municipal context. So the first priority projects in most of those had to do with slightly more discrete, shorter timeline kind of projects. But every town that we have worked with, to be honest, so far has identified it like in their tiered priority table as something they want to do. So sometimes it's a tier 1, sometimes it's a tier 2, but it's been identified in all of those aspects. And we've worked with a professor at the university, looking at how like we can support through this work, like a shift in the engineering standards so that we can try and like prioritize climate resiliency in a way that has us shifting how we approach development. So really what it comes down to is the things that you're identifying as a priority. So for that developer and for that town, I don't think that anyone would sort of take the position that like they were purposely trying to create the inverse of resilience, right? Like their main target is not trying to create a climate problem. Their main target is, how do I make sure that all of this money I'm putting into this house doesn't collapse on someone, right? I need solid ground for that. And they're looking to address like a clear need for housing. And so mostly what this is just, it's a way to shift so that we can achieve all of the goals simultaneously, right? So, and that isn't without its pain points, because, like if some piece of land as a result of the watershed study, is identified as like a critical watershed piece, and then the zoning of that land changes, that's not going to go over smoothly if that happens to be the key place that the developer is looking to develop.
Of course. But
like there's still ways that you can kind of work out how to adjust with that. There's land swaps, and there is a means that if you approach it with a collaborative perspective, I think that you could probably address most of the issues that people are going to face. But if we're gonna make a clear commitment to achieving like carbon neutrality, as a municipality, as a province, as a nation, as the world, as the whole earth, we are going to have to shift our perspective on how those questions get answered in the first place, and then how we solve addressing some of the things that we know are causing emissions and create situations of low carbon and climate resilience.
Wow. Yes, that. That's amazing. So what I'm hearing is that, a really key piece of this kind of work is collaboration, and it's taking in lots of different types of information right up front before decision-making takes place, to ensure that climate resiliency is factored in at a very early stage. But it sounds like, even in the planning and the capital works projects that you've been working on, that spirit of collaboration sort of expands further than that in terms of how you how you approach building partnerships and applying for funding applications, and how we make this kind of funding and this sort of work accessible to municipalities who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. Can you talk a little bit about your experience of sort of, bolstering this collaborative environment in Newfoundland and Labrador to maximize the potential for climate change response?
Yes, sure. So, I mean, in our current context, I mean, coming out of the COVID pandemic and looking towards the future, and I mean, the IPCC issuing the warning of, if we don't hit that 1.5 degree C future, there is a enormously high risk of general calamity. So in that context, I mean, we are seeing the federal budget come through with lots of support towards the green economy. We're seeing the Premier's economic recovery team report that was highlighting the value of how outport communities can contribute, and acknowledging the need for investment in clean tech and a green economy. And I mean, within our own consulting firm, our services very clearly align with the green economy in general. I'm using air quotes, but you can't see me. And I mean, there's just generally a lot of focus on the green aspects of it. And so, I mean, I think our challenge as a province is for us to find ways of accessing all of that funding. So, I mean, Newfoundland has a lot of things that are unique about it. And one of those things is that we don't have sort of the same breadth and depth of layers in our economic ecosystems that other jurisdictions do to access some of this funding. In specific, community-based not-for-profits that are focused on climate. And so for Newfoundland and Labrador, it's very important that we figure out ways to partner and to leverage what does exist, so that we can get access and we can bring in money from external sources to figure out how to undertake these really valuable projects. The flip side of that is, I do honestly believe that by coming together in groups, we do get, I want to say deeper success. That may sound corny, but I think because we're sort of forced into a situation where we have to work together, there has to be a lot of communication. There has to be some collaboration and a participatory outcome. That we do actually have things leveraged maybe a little further than they do in other jurisdictions, which is sort of the two sides of that coin. It may be a little more difficult to kind of get going, but we have a bigger impact in the end. And so we as Fundamental always try and create partnerships. I mean, solving the quote unquote climate crisis is it's going to take everyone, from all aspects. And I mean, within my business experience in general, it's been, the times that we've had really great success have almost always been when we've managed to build a team where everybody brings something really valuable to the table. Everyone is committed to the same clear vision, and everyone is striving within their individual focus to get to that end goal. And so with the Transition 2050 project and with some of the other communities that we've been involved in, it's been that kind of experience, and us being able to move the bar really far, especially for very small communities, because there is power in those numbers. Like we've been able to do some great things in climate action and renewable energy and the green economy in general.
It's a really, really encouraging picture that you're painting, and I think that you're right in terms of the incredible advantage that we have here in the province with respect to, you know, how sort of close-knit our systems are, and it can really sort of fast-track our ability to move things forward once we actually do get everyone around the table working together, like you say. That's fantastic. So what's next post T2050 for these towns and for Fundamental? Where would you like to see it go?
My goodness, where would I like to see it go? I would be really excited if we could. What would I be really excited about? I would be really
probably a lot of things.
There's a lot of things, that happened in my head all at once there. But I would be really excited if we could continue to do like this, like work in the same vein as the Transitions 2050 project allowed. So working with both businesses and municipalities to gather data around emissions, layer that with the projected climate impacts, and then conduct like risk and opportunity analyses. Like that's a sort of general term, but I mean, really it's just, working within the specific context of your client to identify like where the best bang for the buck is, like where is the cost effectiveness, where is the most savings financially, where is the most savings in terms of carbon. Can you leverage that saved carbon on one of the markets, like the voluntary or the regulated markets? Can you invest in those markets through the purchase of carbon offsets to achieve net zero for your organization? And like just continuing along those same sort of lines, aiming for like carbon neutrality by 2050, because I really think that like you have to be able to target it in sort of practical and like bite-sized ways, right? So if you can get going with small things that you can achieve, like it creates a cycle of positive reinforcement as opposed to a cycle of like wrist slapping or we didn't achieve it or that kind of thing. Absolutely. So like start with what you can get done, even if it's small, and then use that to sort of start the swinging of your pendulum to then get momentum and be able to swing it back and forth between, does this reduce our emissions? Does this improve resiliency? Does this save us money financially? Does this make sense for our organization in terms of like our like business and governmental planning and future, right? So like you start the conversation somewhere and you kind of move it forward. So from that perspective, I'd like to see that. I'd also like to see us start, like as a province, start to look at the uniqueness of our province more as opportunities and less as obstacles. So, I mean, there's always conversations about, like, well, we're an island, we have to truck things in, or, well, we're isolated, so it has to be this way, right? So, and instead sort of flip that conversation on its head and say, well, like we have this opportunity because of our context, not in spite of, right? And that once you start to kind of reframe that in your mind, you often see that there's lots of space for innovation as opposed to space for like simply accommodating something, right?
I love that.
And it's a mindset shift, and that's the logic of, I mean, transformational change in general, right? It's like how to, and we're at that moment, like across society as a whole, I think, at present. And that like we have to kind of dig deep and find a different way of doing things. But
wow, yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's fantastic. I love how solutions oriented this is, how interdisciplinary, how collaborative and systems based your thinking is. I'm really excited to see, what these municipalities are doing 5 years from now, and how their inventories have decreased over time as their priority projects unfold. That's awesome. Do you have any last remarks before we clue up? Any advice maybe for future, organizations who might be thinking about pivoting and taking on this kind of work in their role as engineers, as thinkers, as, systems changers in other jurisdictions from what you learned on the project?
I would recommend, to anyone who is looking to try and go down a road of climate change to sort of think about how whatever it is that will improve your business, if there's a way to articulate that from a climate perspective, even if you just sort of adjust how the approach looked to in the beginning, and then find ways to sort of get on a track in terms of funding so that you can actually leverage a lot of the investment that the Canadian government is putting into these things. So for municipalities, that could look like, for example, joining the Partners for Climate Protection program and then following their milestone program.
Right.
Which sort of puts you in a very good position when you're applying to their programs, because you can set it into the context of we're going to follow these milestones, and this is the first, and this is what we want to tackle. So for municipalities, that works out really well. For businesses and not-for-profits, there is really quite a lot of money in terms of improving building energy efficiency and installing renewable energy and shifting from fossil fuel-based systems for heating to electric or biofuel-based solutions. And it makes a good business sense whether you're a municipality or a small or medium or large enterprise. It makes good business sense to start to look at climate conscious metrics in your large scale strategic planning.
I think that's sound advice. I would listen to you. Thanks so much, Ashley, for your time today. I think this is really valuable for our listeners.
Well, thank you. It was lovely talking to you.
And that's a wrap for our episode this week. It was produced by me and Luke Quinton of Electric Ocean. Thanks to our guest, Ashley Smith, Managing Director of Fundamental Inc. Our theme music is Visions of This Earth Before Our Time by Botany, courtesy Western Vinyl. This project was made possible through a grant from the T2050 initiative in partnership with the Newfoundland and Labrador Environmental Industries Association. The Transition 2050 initiative is offered through the Municipalities for Climate Innovation program, which is delivered by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and funded by the Government of Canada. This initiative contributes to the FCM-ICLEI Partners for Climate Protection program to help municipalities reduce greenhouse gas emissions and take action on climate change. PCP is a partnership between FCM and ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability.